safeguard your health. And then lastly, many of you are not getting able to visit your loved ones if they're in a memory care unit or in a hospital or maybe even in rehab. You can't do the kind of visiting you always wanted to do. And that's yet another challenge. You know, Ellen was kind enough to send me some stories of those of you there in Baton Rouge, and I read them all. I was so impressed by them. I want to mention a few of them today. Wandra Jones is caring for her father, Leroy. She's his main caregiver, and she has been for a number of years. And Leroy broke his hip about a year ago and went to the hospital, had an operation. They did excellent work in rehabbing him. They got him going to where he actually was able to walk again. And they sent him home and he was doing well. And then during the virus, he fell again and broke his hip back in April. Had to go back in and have another operation. And this time they sent him home. Oh, you see, now this is what happens in Zoom. My phone is ringing in the background and there's my message. And there's not a thing I can do about it, except we all are going to hear it in the background. That's the joy of Zoom calls. Anyway, I'm talking about Leroy. So he sent him home in this April. They sent him home to his family and no help from home health. They came for a week or two and all of a sudden the family's on their own to do his rehabbing. And here's what Wandra said. We are persisting through the love and care of family. Persisting. It's a great word. It means to keep on day after day, no matter what. And that's what all of us as caregivers have to do. I know that's what I did. And I got to tell you, I was the most unlikely caregiver that ever came along. But I guess I must have persisted. I mean, I know this, I improvised a lot. I asked for a lot of help. I prayed a lot, and I just did my best. Let me take you back to the day my caregiving journey began. It was February the 20th, 1996. I was living in Los Angeles, working as a speechwriter and coach for the CEO of a billion-dollar company. It was 7 a.m. I was sound asleep. The phone rang. I reached for it, and it was my parents' next door neighbor. Hello, Lisa? Lisa Huff? In 34 years of living next to my parents, she had never, ever called me. My whole body braced for bad news, and it wasn't long in coming. She said, Jim, your daddy is out in the front yard, and he's wandering around. It looks like he's in a daze. I think he's having a stroke. I hung up from her. I called home and tried to get my father to come to the phone, but he wouldn't come. I could hear him yelling in the background, but he wouldn't answer the phone. And in that moment, I knew that Lisa's diagnosis was correct. He was having a stroke. You know, the only way that the neighbors could get him to the hospital that day was telling him he was going for Mexican food. Yeah, that's how you get people to the hospital in Texas, Mexican food. So he's going to the hospital. I jump on the next plane I can get on, and I fly to Dallas that day. When I walked in to that intensive care hospital room where my parents' friends and family were gathered, they were looking at me like I was the man with all the answers. I didn't even know the questions because my father had never told me anything. And I walked in, and I see him. He can't walk. He can't talk. He has no control of his bodily functions. And mother, with her Alzheimer's, had no idea what was happening. He'd been taking care of her for 4 or 5 years. Wow. The hospital officials let me know that day, within the first hour of me being there, you have 1 week here in this hospital, and then you got to have him in rehab. Well, the problem was we had good friends and neighbors and church people in Dallas, but no family members. Our family was down south, 200 miles in the Austin area. And when there are crises, friends are great, but family is essential. So I had to fly down to Austin 2 days later. My cousins met me at the airport, and we went around all afternoon auditioning rehab centers. I didn't have any idea what I was looking for. I'd never been to a rehab center. One after the other. Finally, the fourth one we went to, St. David's. A nurse smiled at me. Oh, I needed a smile so bad that week. And I thought, well, maybe her smile is the way the whole hospital is. So I chose St. David's based on a smile. And they told me that they would send an ambulance for my father that next Monday. And they would bring him down 200 miles in the ambulance. Sounded good to me. And they said Medicare would pay for it. Well, I got back to Dallas that night and I told my mother, and she said, honey, do you think Medicare can afford it? I think my mama was ahead of the game, don't you? Of course, then she became the problem because in her sweet Southern Belle way, she said, now, Jim, it's okay for Dad to go down there to Austin. That's all right. But I am staying right here in Dallas in my house. I'm not going anywhere. Well, of course, she couldn't stay in the house. She was not able to live alone, but she didn't know it. So I had to find a way to get her down to Austin to my cousins who had volunteered to take care of her until we could find out what to do. And I came up with a very specific, unusual scientific term to get mother into the car. I call it therapeutic lying. Yeah, therapeutic lying. You may use that someday. Here's what I did. The night before Dad was going down to in the ambulance, I packed the car with mother's clothes the best I could. I'm sure it wasn't pretty, but I got her clothes in the trunk. And then on the morning of Dad going down, I came to my mother, 8:30 in the morning. She's sitting at her breakfast table drinking coffee. I looked her right in the face and I told her what? I said, Mom, would you like to go get some ice cream? My mother never turns down ice cream, not even at 8:30 in the morning. She smiled, just couldn't have been happier. She got up and she walked with me out to the car. I opened the door, she got in, and we drove away from her home of 34 years, and she never saw it again. Now, I don't want you to think I'm a bad guy. I stopped at the very first Dairy Queen we came to. I got her the biggest, gooeyest chocolate sundae you can imagine. And she was very happy eating. And we're headed down the highway to Austin. And I kept waiting for her to say something, to notice that we weren't going home. She never said a word. She got too busy commenting on the colors of passing cars. I was thrilled. I got to Austin. I took her to my cousins. I kissed her goodbye, and I headed back to LA. I'd been gone 11 days. Wow. Then, of course, 2 weeks later, I needed to come back and check on my dad, see how he was doing. I went to rehab, walked into his room, still couldn't walk, talk, no bodily functions, but his eyes were good and his mind was good. Sadly, he was, of course, on top of everything, deaf and would not wear his $3,500 hearing aids. So I walk in, he sees me, and he forces out 3 words. Get me pills. Well, I knew he didn't mean aspirin, and I didn't think that he was in pain, and I looked at his face and I knew what kind of pills he wanted me to get. He wanted me to get pills to help him kill himself because he did not want to stay around dependent. He was a super independent guy. And because, of course, he was deaf, so I yelled in my response. I said, Dad, I can't do that. I'll go to jail. No, not hell, Dad, jail. Well, maybe both. I cannot get you the pills. He did not care for that answer. But what was I to do? I talked to his doctor, and I said, is there anything we can do to help him, help restore his bodily function, help him, maybe he can pee again. Is there something? He said, well, yeah, there's an operation we could do on his prostate. It's about a 50-50 chance that he might be able to go after that. I went, let's do it. We got Dad to sign, did the operation the next week. And 2 weeks later, my father could go to the bathroom on his own, and he wanted to live. That one thing had made all the difference in the world. Well, I went home to LA thinking, okay, we dodged another bullet. Maybe things are going to calm down for a little while. You know how we say that as caregivers, hopeful thinking. Well, I couldn't have been more wrong. 4 weeks later, I get the first of many parent-teacher calls. I got a call from the administrator of the rehab. He said, Jim, I hate to tell you this, but we have to expel your father. Expel my father? Why? He has been yelling at the nurses and cursing at them. I said, that can't be true. My father's a Sunday school teacher. He said, doesn't matter. That's what he's been doing. You've got 1 week to get him out. I couldn't believe this. Well, and of course, I knew by this time that my mother had probably been driving my poor cousins crazy. So I flew back yet again. And I got to tell you, full disclosure, I wasn't paying for these flights because I didn't have enough money to pay for them. Thank goodness my father had a credit card with no balance, so he's paying for these flights. So I flew back yet again on a Friday. And at that time, there was only one facility in all of Austin that had the continuum of care: independent living, assisted living, skilled nursing. One. So I found out about that, and I got home to Austin. I got back. I went to that facility about noon on a Friday. And I told the admissions director, look, I need skilled nursing for dad, and I need assisted living for mom, and I need to get them in on Monday. And she looked at me like I had lost my mind. And she was being kind. She was humoring me. And she took me into her office, and they didn't even have a computer. She had these big old giant books, and she was going through these books and looking. And all of a sudden, she looks down at the director, and she starts jumping around. She said, we've got openings on Monday. And she was jumping around like I had won the lottery. And of course, I had won the lottery. I just didn't know it. I was too new at caregiving. I got them. It was a miracle. I got both of them in on Monday morning. And then I flew back to LA yet again. You see a little pattern here? Well, after about 6 months of this, I realized I just couldn't do what I needed to do from a distance of 1,000 miles. It was just too hard. I had to make a choice. I mean, really, I had to make a decision. Either bring my parents out to California where they didn't know anybody except me, and it was much, much more expensive, or do nothing, which of course was not an option, or quit my really good job, leave my friends and my church and my life, and move back to Texas where I had not lived in 30 years. Well, I chose to parent my parents and come back and be that caregiver like you are. But it was a tough decision. I remember when I told my coworkers out in California that I was going to be moving back to Texas in October after I finished my final projects. They said their mouths said the right words, but their eyes said something different. Their eyes said, oh my God, don't let this happen to me. I saw that over and over again. Well, the fact is, caregiving, one way or the other, it's going to happen to everybody. You know, Woody Allen says that 80% of life is showing up. Well, I showed up in Texas, but I did not have the slightest idea what to do. I didn't have a game plan. I didn't know what I was doing. And the reason that I didn't know what I was doing was that my father, back when he was healthy, those 5 years before the stroke, he would not talk to me about what he wanted when he got older. And he was already old. I mean, I would come home, every time I'd come home for Christmas or in the summer, I would try to get him to talk about mother's condition, and he was in total denial that she had Alzheimer's. Or talking to him about moving down to Central Texas where the rest of the family was. And he would always say, I'll do it next year. We'll talk next year. And if I would push him very hard and try to get an answer, he would get up and walk out of the room. That happened over and over again. And me, being the good Southern boy, I let him get by with that. What was I thinking? I should have followed him out of the room and told him, you've got to talk to me. I've got to know something. But I didn't do that. So I want to say to all of you, if you've got adult children, and I'm sure many of you do, talk to them, keep them up on what you want and don't want. Don't let them be in the dark like I was. You know, I wrote, as a result of having such a hard time adjusting to all these things myself, I eventually wrote a book about caregiving called When Roles Reverse. And in it, maybe the most important pages in it are 50 questions that will save you time, money, and tears. All the things I didn't know when I became a caregiver. I'm going to ask you a few of those questions. Do your parents have an up-to-date will? I'm assuming they do. And if they don't, I want to ask you, why not? They need a will. I hope that you have one, and I hope you know where it is. More important than that is, do you have a will? Every one of you listening to, do you have a will? You know that 7 out of 10 Americans do not have a will. 7 out of 10. 10 out of 10 are going to die. I know because I Googled it. And Google does not lie. Isn't that amazing? 7 out of 10 they think they're going to be immortal. You know, remember the rock singer Prince? Really famous. He had a $250 million estate when he died 3 or 4 years ago. 250, it's $250 million. No will. His brothers and sisters have been fighting in court ever since. Aretha Franklin, $80 million estate, and she had cancer for several years. She knew her health was bad. No will. Her children were fighting in court. I don't want your millions to get tied up in court, or if you're more like me, your thousands. I want them to go where you want them to go. But that will not happen if you don't have a will. It just won't. It's going to be a mess. And you don't want to give that to your children. You don't want that to be your legacy, a mess. So I am urging each one of you, I don't care how old you are, 40s, 50s, early 60s, time for a will. Look what's happened just in the last 3 or 4 months. The COVID virus. And some of those people thought never could happen to them. I'm urging you, please care ahead and go ahead and get that will. And also, second thing, you need to have powers of attorney. Healthcare power of attorney, so that someone that you designate, someone really responsible, can make those healthcare decisions for you when you can't make them. And then you need a durable power of attorney so they can make legal and financial decisions for you. And it's so important to pick the right person to be those powers of attorney. You want someone who really knows what's going on with you, really cares about you, and that has impeccable honesty. And then the third document you need, living will. I'm big on living wills because, you know, here's the deal. Most people think if they just tell their family what they want for end-of-life decisions or for memorial service, if they just tell them, it's okay. Not true. You and I all know what families are like. And boy, there's going to be all sorts of disagreement and people having different ideas. And if you want your wishes to be carried out, you need to have a legal document stating those wishes so that document can speak for you when you can't speak for yourself. Give me some examples on my own living will. And I've got a big one. I don't want a feeding tube. Maybe for a couple of days, maybe, but for long term, no feeding tube for Jim. Don't want it. I don't want to be on a respirator for months and months and months. If I had COVID and it was a few weeks or something, maybe, but I don't want to be in a respirator for 6 months or a year. Absolutely not. And if I had mental problems and my kind of brain dead, I definitely want them to turn off the machine. And also, I wanted them to be very clear about how I want to be buried. I want to be cremated. That's clear about that. And then lastly, the memorial service. I have some strong opinions about that. I think I want to, and I don't want. Now, my father He was very different. He was much smarter than me. When I can remember when I finally brought up the subject of end of life decisions with him, and it took me forever to talk about that. I don't know why I had such trouble. I mean, I was 90% finished writing the book, and I had to cover that in the book before I finally talked to him about it. You know what he said? Jim, do what you want to do. I won't be there. Isn't that smart? Then this next line, I'll never forget. He said, Jim, funerals are for the living. Smart guy. And you know something? He really didn't care. He didn't give me any instructions at all. Oh, the only thing he said was, don't have anybody fly in and spend a lot of money. That's the old depression talking. But you know, he allowed me to do what I wanted to do, and that was a great gift. Now, I'm afraid that I'm not quite as smart as my dad. There are some things that I have down that I definitely do and don't want in my funeral. For example, I have written down the music I want, and I've written down the people I want to speak, and I've written down scripture. For example, music. If someone was to play, "You Light Up My Life" at my funeral, I would zap them. I'd come down from heaven and zap them. So I have written very clearly the music I want. So if you have strong feelings about your memorial service, write them down. Okay, now let's get back to my story. I showed up on October the 6th, 1996 in Texas in a U-Haul, ready to be a caregiver. And, well, I say ready to be, as ready as I could be to be a caregiver. And I got there, and by that time, my dad had had a 100% complete recovery. Yes, between February and October, 100%. He could walk and talk and tell me how to drive just the way he used to. And boy, did he love to tell me how to drive. And as a result, he had found a spot for himself and my mother in an independent living facility near my cousins, which was great. Now, I got to tell you, my mother did not really belong in there, but my father was such a great salesman. That's what he did for a living. He talked them into letting her come. And then he, who had just had a stroke, would be the one to take care of her. Hard to believe, but he did it. In fact, they had rooms right next to each other on the 4th floor. There was no double, so they had to be separate rooms, but right next door to each other. And here's the part you'll love. Remember, my father is deaf. They put the telephone in the room of the deaf person. That was before I got there, but there it was. You see, the phone would ring. My father, right there, would not hear it. Mother, next door, would hear it. She had great hearing. She would get her key out. She'd walk. She'd go open the door to his room. She'd go in. She'd answer the phone. Hello. And then she would take a message in her beautiful penmanship. And then she would hand that to my father, who could understand it and respond to it. Together, they made one wonderful person. So that was what was going on when I arrived. Now, the main thing that I had to get used to right away was dementia, Alzheimer's, on a daily basis, because it's very different when you fly in for Christmas or a few days in the summer. You don't really get the full picture at all. But boy, now I was there all the time. And I was surprised. For example, my mother had about 50, 60 dresses in her closet. Lovely wardrobe. She would only wear 5 of them. And I said, Mama, why won't you wear more of your clothes? Why don't you wear all these dresses? She said, honey, I can't do that. They are stolen. Those dresses are stolen. Do you want me to go to the Hooskow? Hooskow would be Texas for jail. And my mother is the only person I know that might have possibly said that word. She really believed that most of the clothes in her closet were stolen. She really believed that. And I could not convince her. And I mean, I gave it my very best shot. I even showed her the dress I gave her for her 50th anniversary, this beautiful dress. She didn't believe it was hers. So all of a sudden, I realized that she was no longer living in the land of logic. Then came a really important day. She asked if we could go see her sister, Estelle, in Smithville. And I made a really big mistake. I said, Mama, we can't go see Estelle. She's in heaven. Well, Mother got that news as if it was the first time she'd ever heard it. She started crying and sobbing, shoulders going up and down, tears coming down her face. She must have cried for 15 minutes. And I'm watching her going, what have I done? I just told the truth. Well, there's times to tell the truth, and there's times not to tell the truth. So I made an appointment the next day with an Alzheimer's specialist because I needed some answers. I walked into her room and I said, I don't think I can do this. And she said, honey, from what I hear, you don't have much choice. Of course, she was right. And then I said, well, what do I do? She said the best advice I ever got about caregiving. One sentence that changed my life. She said, quit trying to drag your mother into your world. She can't go there anymore. Instead, you must go into her world. Go into her world. The minute she said that, I got it. It made all the sense in the world to me. And I began doing that, going into my mother's world, starting that day, and I did it for the next 14 years, and it changed everything. For example, my mother was pretty sharp. These when I first got home. She had dementia, but she was still very funny, great conversationalist. So I dealt with her as best I could. And as she began to lose cognitive ability over the years, I tried to adjust it to where she was. Not where she'd been, not where I wanted her, but where she was. And that went on. And then about 8 years in, one day I came to see her, and she looked at me blank. She had absolutely no idea who I was. I knew that day was going to come. I wasn't thrilled about it, but what was I going to do? I had to just respond. So I did the only thing I needed to do. I improvised my favorite thing. I said, Jim Comer, your firstborn, shook her hand, smiled, gave her a big hug. And she kind of looked back and smiled because my mother was very friendly. And she thought she'd be nice to this young stranger. Well, younger stranger, I'll say. Anyway, so she welcomed me into her world as this person named Jim Comer, even though she didn't know anymore that I was her son. So I had two choices. I could have been upset about it, or I could have dealt with it. That's what I tried to do. And then as time went on, as the years passed, eventually Mother couldn't make sentences anymore. Only words would come out. So I'd try to find a key word and respond to it, whatever it was. I mean, I knew that she loved going to the garden, even when it was 103, like it is today here. And we would go to the garden a lot. I would sing to her a lot because she loved my voice, thank goodness. And we would eat ice cream a lot. We'd do the things that she liked. And even in the last years, when she couldn't talk, I responded to the look on her face, gave her hugs, and just did the things I knew she wanted to do. And that really did make the difference for me. You know, it's easy to talk about going into their world, but I know it's not. I know it's hard to do. I mean, I know we have all seen people, caregivers, who get frustrated, especially dealing with dementia. It's frustrating. I get it. I mean, I have seen caregivers out in public. It could be at church. It could be in a cafeteria, a mall, and there's an adult caregiver and say a 80-year-old, 90-year-old person with dementia. And here's what they're saying. Mama, I just told you that. I said that 3 times in a row. Why don't you remember? Ever seen that happen? Sure you have. And it may have happened to you. It's perfectly, that's the challenge. We have to remember that if they could remember, they would remember, right? And it's hard for us as caregivers to remember that. When I first got to Texas, my mother was still pretty sharp, and in her memory, she knew that I was infamous for running out of gas. I had run out of gas my whole life. I don't know why. I don't do it anymore, but back then I still ran out of gas a lot. And she had that deep in her memory. So when I would come to see her in independent living, she'd say, Jim, how are you fixed for gas? Don't you lie to your mama. You tell me the truth. Do you have gas in that car? The first thing she would say many times. And of course, I would lie and say, Mama, I just filled it up. It's full tank, mother, full tank. Yeah. But once she got that into her mind about the gas, woo, she would play that number. She might ask me that same question about, how do you fix for gas? She might ask that question 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 times in one visit. I'm not kidding. And it was my job to answer her 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times in one visit without attitude. Now, I am not telling you that I was perfect in doing that, but I think I was about 90%. And that's about as good as we can get. If we can get close to 90, that's pretty good. It's, here's the deal. We have a choice always when we're dealing with someone with dementia. We can either worry about them being right and getting, saying everything correct, or us being kind. When you're faced with a choice of them being right and correcting them, or you being kind and loving, go for kind every time. You just can't go wrong if you go for kind. Thank goodness my mother had a great sense of humor, which really helped a lot. I can still remember one day, that first year I came in to see her, and my shoes were scuffed up. I mean, they had mud on them or something. They were not in good shape, and she had great eyes. She saw those shoes right away, and she said, "Ooh!" She scrunched up her face. "Jim, those shoes are a scandal to the jaybirds." Now, that is a deep East Texas expression, and it means not good. So I said, "Now, Mama, don't worry. I'm going to get new shoes when I'm rich." And she said, "Oh, Jim, don't wait that long." How did she know? I'm still waiting. Oh, and then there was this guy who lived in their independent living. He was 92 years old, and he thought my mother was fantastic. He just was her biggest fan. Every time I would walk through the lobby to see my parents, he'd come up to me and start raving on about my mother's charms. So I over and over this happened. And finally I figured, Mother needs to know that she has an admirer. So I said, "Mama, did you know there is a 92-year-old man who thinks you are terrific?" And she said, "Honey, that's the kind I attract." Now that's a great line. That's a comedy writer's line, and it came out of my mom's mouth. Then there was my father. Deaf, demanding, and defiant. And I had no idea how much he liked his scotch. I mean, I knew he liked it. I just didn't know he liked it. And he had found a World War II buddy, because he said my dad had flown B-17s with the Army Air Force. He did 75 combat missions over Germany. He found this World War II buddy who lived on the second floor. So many nights, Dad would go from the fourth floor down to the second. He'd get together with his buddy, and they would refight the war and drink a little, well, actually, drink a lot of scotch. And then around 10:30, when Germany had fallen yet again, and Hitler had put a bullet through his head, my father would try to head back to his room. And he almost always made it, except for a few times. He would head down that long wall-to-wall covered, carpeted hallway, and he'd be headed for his room, but sometimes he would look at that thick carpet, and it would just look so appealing, and it would call to him, and he would lower himself down and lie on the floor all the way out. And of course, he was going to only be there for a second. He would go straight to sleep. And 10 minutes later, 15 minutes, somebody would come down the hall. They would see this body and they would go, oh my gosh, he's dead, stroke, heart attack. They would call the front desk. The front desk would call EMS. The EMS would send the ambulance. They would rush him to the emergency room. The doctors would be waiting. Diagnosis, bombed. And I would get parent-teacher call. Jim, what are you going to do about your dad's drinking? What do you tell a 90-year-old about drinking? It's going to stunt your growth? I don't think so. This happened twice in 1 year. 2 times. I mean, I was really getting worried. I was afraid they'd kick Dad out. I mean, he had been kicked out of other places, as we all know. And so I didn't want that to happen. So I went to the administrator of the independent living, who was a Methodist minister. And I took him out to lunch. And I asked him, what are we going to do about Dad's drinking? And I was waiting. I didn't know what he was going to say. And he looked at me and he said, Jim, I admire your father so much. He did amazing work during World War II. What he did in the Air Force and surviving all those missions just is amazing to me. And I love the way he cares for your mother. He's so kind to her, and he makes it possible for her to stay here. And if he needs a little scotch to do it, it's okay with me. I could not believe he was saying it. Methodist minister telling me that. Thank goodness. That took a tremendous weight off my shoulders. They were giving my father a break. But he still had a little trouble with drinking over the next year. No more passing out in the hall. So I finally thought, I've got to find out, where is he getting the booze? Because he's not coming from me. He's not buying it because he can't drive. So I had to try to find out where it was coming from. I had no idea. You know who I asked? The source of all knowledge, the maid on the 4th floor. She told me where it was coming from. The guy who used to live on the 2nd floor had moved out. And when he would come to see Dad, he'd bring in scotch. So I found this guy's phone number. I called him up and I said, look, I appreciate your kindness to my father, but he is cut off. No more scotch. And then he said, okay. So then I thought, well, I'm going to find whatever he's got in the closet. I'm going to get rid of that. So while my father is watching Lawrence Welk over here, I go into his closet. I'm thinking there's going to be one little bottle. There were 2 half gallons. And I took those out. I sneaked them into the hall. And I don't drink. So that night I was going to a party. I brought the half gallons of scotch as my hostess gift. And I kept waiting for my father to say something. He never mentioned it. And the booze problem was history. One more time for improvisation. Persistence paid off. Well, we had about 5 years in independent living. And I have to admit, I got a little cocky. I thought, this isn't so bad. I can do this. I'm doing all right. Oh, it's okay. Well, what happens when you think that? Well, there were a couple of times that threw me. I'll never forget one Sunday. I'd come for lunch because Sunday lunch was the best meal of the day. I don't know if that's true at your care facilities, but oh boy, it was the best one at this. So I showed up every Sunday lunch. And there I am sitting next to my father, and I had just got the first bite of pot roast. It's on my fork, headed toward my mouth. And suddenly my father says loudly, Jim, I want you to give me an enema after lunch. I just knocked all my pages to the floor. Anyway, that's how I felt then and now. I was not thrilled. But I gave it my best shot. Let's just say I must have not been a very good enema giver because he never asked for that service again. Well, so time goes on. It's Christmas Eve of 2000. And I'm feeling pretty good. But that night, my mother, on the way to the bathroom in the middle of the night, fell and broke her hip. and they had an operation on Christmas Eve morning, and she was out of it for 2 or 3 days with the anesthesia. She came, and of course, the second day that she was in the hospital, they took out her dentures and put them on the tray beside her food, and some fool took the tray and dumped it in the dumpsters. And we searched for hours. We could not find those dentures. So within 2 days, my mother lost the ability to walk and to chew. It was tough. They sent her after the hospital. They sent her to rehab, but with her dementia, she couldn't make it in rehab. So they gave me 1 day to find a nursing home for her. 1 day. And it was at Christmas. They were all packed. And the one that I wanted, the nursing home that was the best in town, had 1 bed open. And it was in a room with 3 other people, like the only room in the whole place that had 3 people. That's what they had. So that's what we took. I got to tell you, I was not happy. I guess my ego was involved. How dare they put my mother in a room with 3 other people? That's how kind of I went into it, because they'd gone from the 4th floor overlooking trees to overlooking the parking lot on the 1st floor. Not good. But here's the deal. I just kept showing up, persisting, acting as if it was going to be okay. And within 2 or 3 weeks, my mother got better. I began to see how the staff was treating her, the kindness and the love, and she seemed okay. She seemed fairly happy. She never, she spent 9 years in that room. I kept her there because it was right across from the nursing station, and I realized what a big, good deal that was. So I never moved her. And she never, ever mentioned any of her roommates in 9 years. As far as she was concerned, it was her room. So I realized that was just my ego getting in the way. And as time went on, I began to see the goodness of what she had. The staff really was treating her well. She was happy. And I began to get to know the other residents and their families, and I became a part of that community. But I had to choose to do that. I had to be open to it for it to happen. And it took me about a month, but I'm so glad that I was able to do that. Now, here's the deal. Mother was on A wing, and this was the first time in 60 years she had not been living with my father. And she liked it. She liked the independence because, he was kind of telling her what to do over in independent living. No more. She was like, and she was very popular with the staff because she was funny. So there she was on A wing. Well, 7 months later, on July 4th, we were really big on holidays that year, my father fell in his room in the middle of the night, going to the bathroom, and he broke his hip. He went to the same doctor, same operation, same rehab. He lasted about 2 weeks in rehab. Then he needed a nursing home. Well, we got him into the same nursing home. He had his own private room. And of course, I made sure that he was on B wing and mother was on A wing, so he wasn't trying to run her life. Now, here's the deal. My father wanted desperately to go back to independent living. We kept his room available because he said, I'm going to learn how to walk. I'm going to get back. He was real big on, he was going to be able to get back. He did all the exercises and all the rehab. He kept telling me, I've got it. I'm getting it. I've got it. Well, 2 or 3 months went by and he kept saying he was getting it. And then the staff came to me and they said, Jim, your dad can't make it on his own. He can't dress himself. He's not able to do all the toileting he needs. He needs to be here, Jim. He's got to stay in the nursing home. And they said, you have to tell him this. Not my favorite moment. So I told my father. He was very unhappy and he was really depressed. And I was depressed. So, I went to the medical director and I said, could we get some Prozac? He said, oh yeah, I'll be happy to get your father some Prozac. I said, not my father, me. Well, he gave us both Prozac and it helped. It really did help. And eventually, as time went on, my father adapted to the nursing home. Took a while, but he did. And I remember on my mother's, about 6 months later, my mother turned 90. And I decided to have a big party for her. And I had all the family and the relatives, and must have been 60 different wheelchairs that came into A Wing. And this was the first time I brought my father over from B Wing to A Wing, which is a complicated bunch of halls. He came over for the party. We had a music, I had a singer and a pianist. Oh, it was great. And after the party was over, I went up to my father, because I don't care how old you are, we always want our parents' approval, don't we? So I went up to my father and I said, well, Dad, how did you like the party? And he said, oh, it was okay, except for all the old people. He did not think he was an old people, even though he was 91 and a half. Go figure. Well, here's the amazing thing about that. My father, with his brilliant mind, had memorized the route to my mother's room going one time. I couldn't memorize it in one time, but he did. And the next day, Monday, in the middle of the lunch rush, he wheeled himself over to mother's room and found her and began dragging her back to his, come on, I want you to come to my room. He's dragging her wheelchair along, and she's yelling and knocking trays and screaming and I get parent-teacher call. Jim, what are you going to do about your dad? He's raising hell on A Wing. Time for improvising again, right? So I thought, what do I do? What do I do? I typed out new rules for the nursing home. Mother is happy on A Wing. They are taking great care of her. She's not wandering. You do not have to worry about mother. You do not have to, a long list of things that I thought my father would get. Typed them up, printed them out, went over to my father, sat down with him, made him put on his glasses, put in his hearing aids. I said, okay, now, Dad, let's read these together. We read through them. I said, do you understand, Dad? Do you understand? He said, yes, I understand. I said, good. He said, I only want one thing. What? I want this paper signed by the commandant. Commandant. That's a World War II term. It means the head man on the base. And I thought, who would he be talking about? He means the nursing home administrator. I took the paper. I went to the nursing home administrator. He was in a meeting. I got him out of the meeting. I said, this is an emergency. Brought him in front of my father, and I had him sign the paper in front of my dad. And my father kept it in a drawer by his bed. And he never bothered my mother again. Now, that's one of the times that improvisation works. It doesn't always work. We know that, but that time it did. And you see, I would get them together. I don't want you to think that they never saw each other. On weekends or when I would come over, I'd get them together in the living room. But you see, their ability to communicate was limited because Dad couldn't hear and Mother couldn't remember. So the conversations were somewhat limited. They gave each other a hug and they would sit by each other. And we did that. Now, I'm down to my last 4 minutes here. What do I want to say in my last 4 minutes? Well, I want to talk about one of the other stories that I got that's happening there in Baton Rouge. And this has to do with, where's the name? I've lost the name here. Is it Frank Pitts? I think I've got that right. Frank and Diane Pitts. Frank is a famous football star. He had 10 years in the NFL. He's got a Super Bowl ring. And he has a grandson who's playing for the NFL right now, who also has a Super Bowl ring. In fact, that's the only people in history where the grandfather and the grandson have both been to the Super Bowl. Well, Frank and Diane have a wonderful relationship. And they love to be together. They love to laugh together. But during the COVID crisis, Frank was in memory care, and his wife couldn't go see him. And that was the first time they'd been separated like that ever. And so they had to improvise as well. And they began communicating with FaceTime. And somebody had to help Frank do it, but he was able to do it. He'd able to talk and see his wife. And then when things got better, they were able to have visits, what they call healthy family visits, where they were outside and they're 6 feet apart, but they were able to be together yet again. And that's the kind of improvising we have to do, whether it's COVID virus or not. But I want you all to remember, I know it is hard right now. It's hard for all of us, but it's especially hard for caregivers. I want you to remember that your love for your spouse or your parent is stronger than the virus. I really mean that. The virus is gonna go someday. We're gonna get it, but your love is gonna last. And just remember that. I, as a caregiver, caregiving for me was probably the most important thing I ever did. Not the easiest, not the one I chose, but it was the best experience I ever had. I learned that caregiving is an art, not a science. There's no one right way. There's the way you do it. I learned that dignity comes in many shapes, including bent and wrinkled and walker assisted. I found that patience is the currency of love. I began to even learn the meaning of a word that I'd never known before: unselfish. I'd spent the whole life, me. And finally, as a caregiver, I had to put somebody else first. And that was a wonderful experience. The great English poet Wordsworth said the best part of a good person's life are the little unremembered acts of kindness and of love. Little unremembered acts of kindness and love. Well, as caregivers, that's what you do every day, day after day. I believe that caregiving is God's work. And then when we do it the best we can, we're letting God's light shine through us. I'm so happy to have been with you today, and I really look forward to answering any of your questions.
Thank you, Jim. That was an absolutely wonderful presentation. I can't say enough good things about it. Thank you.